of the drug AZT in delaying the progression of disease in certain AIDS-infected persons who have not yet developed symptoms. Leading the news briefing was the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Dr. Louis Sullivan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kay James, and I'm Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the Department of Health and Human Services. First of all, let me thank you for joining us on such short notice, but we appreciate your being here to receive this news today. I want to take care of one housekeeping item before we move on. If you would turn to page 2 of your press release, we do want to have one correction. Second paragraph down, the board found that in those participants with fewer, and you need to insert fewer than 500 T4 cells. I would appreciate that. That would make it reflect accuracy. Joining me today is Secretary Sullivan, also Dr. Fauci, Director of the Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and also Assistant Secretary Dr. Mason, who is also Acting Surgeon General. We will follow the program in that order. At the end of their presentations, we will be happy to receive questions from you at that time. I would ask several things. First, that when you ask your question, you would identify your affiliation. I would also ask that because of the large number of press present, that you would please limit yourselves to one question and perhaps one follow-up. Thank you very much. Secretary Sullivan.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to announce today the first results from the largest AIDS clinical trial ever conducted. With these results, we are witnessing an additional significant milestone in the battle to change AIDS from a fatal disease to a treatable one. The study showed that zidovudine, or AZT, delays progression of the disease in certain people infected with the human immunodeficiency virus who have not yet developed symptoms. Only 2 weeks ago, we announced that this drug slows progression of the HIV infection in persons with early AIDS-related complex, or ARC. What we've learned from these 2 studies provides real hope for the millions of people worldwide who are infected with HIV. More than 3,200 volunteers are participating in the current study, which began 2 years ago. It is being conducted in 32 of the 46 units of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and is being done in collaboration with Burroughs Wellcome. We've seen a progression in which the effectiveness of AZT has been shown, first for full-blown AIDS, then for those exhibiting the symptoms of AIDS-related complex, and now, most encouraging of all, for those who are infected and show a specific level of damage to their T4 cell count, but who are otherwise without symptoms. This finding underlines anew the need for people to voluntarily undergo HIV testing and counseling. We are indeed entering the period when AIDS may become a treatable disease. But in order to fully benefit from treatment, it will be crucial for a person to know early that he or she may be infected. Once again, I reinforce the message which the Public Health Service has emphasized. Every person who has reason to believe or suspect that he or she has been exposed to the virus should seek testing and counseling. Likewise, I want to emphasize that our findings today in no way reduces the importance of our prevention efforts. AZT is not a cure, and indeed, even those who are under AZT treatment remain capable of transmitting the disease. Education and healthy behavior are still our best weapons against the AIDS epidemic, and that message must not be obscured or misunderstood. Dr. James Mason, our Assistant Secretary for Health and Acting Surgeon General, and Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, are here to tell you the details of this trial. The progress represented by these studies, which has been accomplished in remarkably short time, is the fruit of an extraordinary collaboration among the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, many medical centers around the country, and the drug manufacturer. I'm now pleased to present Dr. Mason for his remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. As you recall, just 2 weeks ago, we were able to announce findings that zidovudine, or AZT, significantly slows the progression of HIV infection in people with early AIDS-related complex, an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 individuals. Today's announcement raises the total of people who can benefit from early use of AZT to some 600,000. This is truly good news for the fight against AIDS and HIV, a subject about which the news has frequently been all too grim. I would like to emphasize that the progress that we are announcing today would not have been possible without the crucial cooperative efforts of government, academia, and industry. I would like to acknowledge also the tremendous contribution of Dr. Paul Volberdine of the University of California at San Francisco and San Francisco General Hospital, who coordinated the study we are discussing today. Dr. Volberdine is seated in the front row. With Dr. Volberdine is Dr. David W. Berry of Burroughs Wellcome Company with members of his staff, all of whom, of course, have been instrumental in the development of zidovudine for treatment of AIDS and HIV infection. With us also in the front row is Dr. Frank Young, Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, who worked tirelessly to shorten the time it takes to get drugs from the laboratory to patients who need them. I will now introduce to you Dr. Tony Fauci, the Director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease.
Thank you, Dr. Mason, Dr. Sullivan. The trial, known as ACTG Protocol 019, compares 2 doses of zidovudine, or AZT, with placebo in 2 groups of HIV-infected volunteers who have no symptoms. One group included those who had T4 cell counts above 500. The second group included those who had T4 cell counts below 500. Yesterday, August 16th, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board, which periodically reviews the study data, recommended that the placebo arm of the study be halted for participants with fewer than 500 T4 cells, and that all participants whose T4 counts are less than 500 should be offered AZT. This recommendation is based on the fact that in participants with fewer than 500 T4 cells, the rate of progression to AIDS or severe ARC for those receiving treatment was roughly half the rate for participants who received placebo. Specifically, there were approximately 3,200 volunteers in the study, and approximately 1,300 had CD4 or T4 cells less than 500. In the group of T4 cells less than 500, there were 74 who progressed on to either AIDS or severe ARC, 55 to AIDS and 19 to severe ARC. There were 38 progressions in the placebo group and only 17 in the low-dose group and only 19 in the high-dose group. Because the data from this study have shown that the short-term risk of developing AIDS is negligible in asymptomatic persons with more than 500 T4 cells, the study will continue for that latter group. One of the most important findings of this study is that toxic side effects were minimal for participants receiving either 500 milligrams per day or 1,500 milligrams per day. In fact, with the exception of nausea that occurred in approximately 3% of the volunteers, Virtually no differences in side effects were observed in persons receiving the lower dose and persons receiving placebo. This further corroborates the finding of NIAID's study of patients with early ARC with fewer than 5% of drug recipients experiencing serious side effects. These two studies provide irrefutable evidence of the clear-cut benefits of early diagnosis of HIV infection and early treatment for certain infected persons. Thank you. Dr. Sullivan, Mason, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.
I would again remind you, please identify your affiliation, and let's see how many questions we can get in before the Secretary has to depart. Yes.
Steve Shepard, ABC, is for Dr. Sullivan.
Doctor, as we know, AZT is an expensive drug, and there's some question about, now that its efficacy is being shown to be greater and greater, the question is, are there plans in HHS or the federal government to make sure that those who don't have the money can in fact have access to this drug?
Yes, well, as you know, already the reimbursement for this drug is available under the already existing mechanisms in the program, federal sources, as well as through the usual private sources. But based upon these findings today, to help address the question that you have indicated, I've directed our officials in Medicare to begin reimbursement for the use of the drug. Now, this is a preliminary decision because this represents, with the findings today, a new decision, a new use, actually, for the use of this drug in asymptomatic individuals. For this to be reimbursable under the usual mechanism under law in which we have to operate, the FDA would have to examine these new findings and make a determination that this is an appropriate application for this drug. So this order that I am issuing today does in no way prejudice the future findings of the FDA. This is to work until we have an opportunity for Commissioner Young and his colleagues at the FDA through the procedures prescribed under law to make that finding. Further, those states that reimburse for the use of this drug under their Medicaid program, and this is a state decision, of course, we match those state funds under our Medicaid program for the use of the drug.
Yes. Right here.
Richard Sorian with Medicine and Health. To follow up, though, at the end of the current fiscal year, which is the end of next month, the $30 million program to help people who don't qualify for Medicaid to buy this drug expires. And so far on the appropriations bill passed by the House, there's no new money. Will you request some new money to help those people continue to get the drug after October 1st and after the new fiscal year?
Yes, well, this finding that we're reporting to you today, we were aware of this only late yesterday when the code was broken. This, the question you raise, as well as a number of other detailed questions, are ones which we have to look at and examine in some detail before we will be able to give a definitive response. And this is why we have made the decision, using my secretarial discretionary authority, for the direction for our Medicare program to reimburse for the use of this drug until we have a chance to evaluate this new use by our FDA procedures. Yes.
Michael Spector from the Washington Post. At the Montreal AIDS Conference, the New York City health commissioner shocked a lot of people by saying that AIDS was becoming more a treatable disease, that there was reasons to trace HIV infection, and that it was no longer reasonable not to do that. This would seem to lend some credence to that, because clearly there seem to be fewer and fewer reasons not to be tested for HIV. Do you now believe that contact tracing should be implemented in states where it now is not, and do you think that should be a law?
Yes, our position has been and continues to be one of urging individuals to volunteer for testing. We believe that this is very appropriate, and we believe that these findings that we're reporting today would indeed lend further credence and usefulness to that testing. But we remain in our position of urging such testing to be voluntary, but certainly that would include contact tracing. We urge individuals who are found to be positive for the test. Indeed, to urge that their contacts come in for testing as well. But that is our position, and that remains so. Yes?
This would be more for Dr. Fauci or Dr. Volberding. Did you culture blood from people to look for selection of AZT-resistant strains? And are you worried that when you start people at such an early time on AZT that you will eventually or sooner make them resistant to the drug?
Well, I'll take a shot at it, and then if, Paul, you have any additional comments, they're welcome. The whole concept of AZT resistance, the knowledge of that is really incomplete at the present time. As many of you know, when the in vitro tests for AZT resistance for HIV showed that in fact there could be resistance developing, that there was really not enough data to make a clinical extrapolation for that. That doesn't mean that there might not be clinically significant AZT resistance that would develop, but at this particular point in time, we do not have enough data to make any pronouncements. However, if one looks at the relative risk-benefit of what we know about resistance and the fact that you can prevent, or delay the progression of disease in these numbers of individuals with AZT, that the clinical judgment is that it weighs very much in favor of going for the delay in the progression of the disease rather than presuming that you may develop resistance at a time later on when in fact we may have combinations of drugs or other drugs that might obviate or circumvent the problem of resistance. Paul, do you have any further comment on that?
We've been requested for the three of us to be at the podium for the photographers, so we'll do this. But meanwhile, those who have a question, we can proceed. Yes.
Henry Cavan, can you tell me, the figure used is 600,000 potential beneficiaries as a result of the announcement you're making today. I don't think you're quite clear on the cost impact that will come out of this. Can you be more specific and tell us what this program is going to cost in the long term, where the funds will come from, and what the problems are in raising those funds?
The total cost of this therapy, I think, remains to be determined. For the usual AZT therapy for a patient for AIDS, of course, has been around $7,000 to $8,000 a year. There's some evidence from the study that we're reporting today that lower doses of AZT are effective in delaying the onset of symptoms in infected asymptomatic individuals. What the cost implications of that would be, or what the costs might be with larger amounts of the drug being made available, I think we cannot determine. So I think that is a very good question that we ourselves are anxious to find out. Our report today is to report the good news of this new finding, and of course the cost analysis we will have to do.
Are you saying that someone who is a beneficiary might be a beneficiary for many, many years? In other words, a user of ACT over long periods, decades perhaps?
Well, that's theoretically possible. I'm going to ask Dr. Fauci. Of course, the study itself has been going on for 2 years, I believe.
Right.
So that is as long as we have data, and how long how long AZT will be effective in delaying the onset of symptoms or progression of disease, I think remains to be determined with the continuation, of the study. But I would say that we don't yet have that endpoint, but the study is being continued.
Sorry,
All right.
as the medical practitioner.
The study was started in July of 1987 and was terminated in July of 1989. So up to 2 years people are on it with a mean of approximately 1 year. So although we cannot say how long this delay in progression will be realized in the real world, we do know that within the framework of the clinical trial it's a mean of about a year. I might just make sure that we get the numbers correct regarding the number of individuals who this would benefit. The 016 protocol in early ARC with 1 or 2 symptoms with T4 cells less than 500 that was announced a week or so ago we felt that that would be approximately 95 to 200,000 individuals. This study would encompass approximately 400 to 425,000. Both of those together is where we get the 600,000 number. This, not just the asymptomatics, but the 600,000. And that's based on epidemiologic studies in the multi-center AIDS cohort study of the NIAID, in which we follow a number of patients and get some projections of how many patients percentage-wise fall within a certain CD4 symptomatic or asymptomatic category, and then take that fraction of what the projection of the number of infected people are in the country. That's where we get that number.
Yes.
Jim Nash from INN. In the simplest possible terms, then, does this mean that people who have not yet developed AIDS symptoms but who take AZT can expect to put off development of the disease for at least a year by taking it?
If their T4 cell counts are 500 or less, the data on those who fall within the arm of the study whose T4 counts were greater than 500 is insufficient to make any statement. But if you take individuals without any symptoms who have T4 cells of 500 or less, we know from this study quite clearly that there will be a delay in progression significantly greater than for individuals who do not take the drug, namely placebo.
Yes.
Dr. Fauci, could you say, in terms of the side effects, what was found on those patients? Most of the patients had what was the effect on their red blood cell counts or other effects, even though they may not have been made ill, in terms of long-range use?
It was very interesting. In the low-dose group, there was virtually no difference in any toxic side effect profile between that low-dose group and individuals who were on the placebo group. And even in the situation in the low-dose group, there was a very small percentage, approximately 3% of which had nausea. But the difference between placebo and low dose was essentially non-significant in any of the parameters that were studied. The high dose, there was what you'd expect of hematologic and other side effects to the tune of approximately 10 or so percent, approximately 10 or 12%.
Question.
Looking at the range of all the encouraging sort of therapeutic advances that we've seen emerging over the past year or two, where would you rate this? Would you say that this is sort of the most significant in terms of, therapeutic advances that we've seen in AIDS research, simply because it does make an impact so early?
Yeah, Marlene, I hate to use the word most significant in situations like that. I think, well, no, even thus far, I think the fact that a drug, AZT, back in the earlier study, which was shown to be active and to have an effect in prolonging the survival of individuals who have full-blown AIDS, I think was the landmark. With regard to impact, I would say this certainly has a broad impact. So if you use the word impact, I think the broadness of the impact of this, I think, is the most significant.
Just follow up. You have said on many occasions that what you foresee or what you see ahead is the ability to control this disease once someone is determined to be infected. In the same way that diabetes and high blood pressure. Within that context, wouldn't this be the most significant?
You always want me to say something is most. Let me just say that I think this is a very important step in the scientific confirmation of what we had been hoping for, that when one treats early, one can in fact go from what had previously been thought to be an inevitably lethal disease to, at least within the framework of the time frame of this study, to have a disease that looks like it can be controllable over time. And that's what I think you heard the Secretary and Dr. Mason say about the fact that we were dealing here now with a controllable disease. What we've been talking about, the analogy between this and diabetes and insulin and high blood pressure medicine and hypertension, I think is becoming more clear and is crystallizing with the kinds of studies that we're seeing now. It certainly isn't the end. We're not talking about a cure, but we're talking about certainly a very important step in the delay in progression in these types of individuals.
If I might add to that, I think certainly in terms of the numbers of individuals who would benefit from the finding reported today, obviously I think that certainly is greater than previous reports, but I would certainly concur with Dr. Fauci. It's difficult to say that this is the most important finding, because obviously the previous studies have laid the foundation which have allowed the current studies which you're reporting today to progress. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Jane Garrison from the Examiner, and I think this is really directed toward Dr. Berry. Is there enough supply of AZT to meet the demand of 600,000 people? And with that many people needing the drug, is there going to be any change in the price?
I'm Dr. David Barry, Vice President of Research for Burroughs Wellcome Company. Somehow I thought that question might come up. As Dr. Sullivan mentioned, a lot of these data are extremely new to us, with many, many variables involved. Not only the number of patients who might be eligible, but also the factors such as the number of patients who in fact know they're infected, the dose of drug that might be optimum for these patients. These are all variables that we've had a very quick chance to go through, and from what we estimate now, because we had anticipated such an eventuality and had really had a lot of capital expansion, long-term investment in this area, we believe that we can meet the expected immediate demand. But I'd caution you by saying we don't believe the immediate demand is 600,000 patients. Now, as more extensive testing, serologic testing for HIV infection occurs, I fully imagine that there will be many more of these patients who will be identified. And at that point, we will have sufficient warning to be able to expand whatever manufacturing amount that we have to meet the expected demand. Now, in regard to price, I can assure you first that we review the price on an extremely regular basis. That price is determined by a large number of factors, not only the amount of drug that we sell, but the dosage patients take, the number of patients who may be taking it, but also the long-term investment that we have to make, not just to support the drug itself, and to support continued research in AIDS, which we continue to do at a very high rate, because as I'm sure the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary of Health will assure you, AIDS research is highly expensive. But we also have to have very expensive research in other innovative areas, not just AIDS, but cancer, chronic neurologic disease, and a number of other areas. And this research is highly expensive. We certainly spend well over $300 million per year in research in innovative areas. So all of those factors are taken into account when we look at the price. And we are continuing to take those factors into account and will continue to inform both the public and the Secretary if there are any changes. Yes?
Irwin area for employers. I'm a little foggy on what it means to say that you directed Medicare to begin reimbursing for the drug. And does that, and also from what someone else said, does this mean that even though Medicare may begin reimbursing, will they stop doing this October 1 unless you make an additional request?
No, the order that I've issued gives authority for reimbursement to begin while the FDA undergoes the review of this as a new use of this drug, which they are required to do by law. That process takes, at a minimum, several weeks and maybe several months.
Who are the beneficiaries of that then?
That anyone who is eligible for Medicare reimbursement for medical procedures would benefit from that. In addition to which, as I stated, the Medicaid program is one that is administered by the states. The states determine the eligibility for support under that program, so that we have both our Medicare and our Medicaid programs. If a state determines that this is an appropriate use for which they would reimburse for that care, then the federal share would be available for that Medicaid reimbursement as well.
Dr. Fauci,
Yes.
Don Baraska, Bureau of National Affairs. Is a protocol been developed yet for use of DDI combined and AZT?
Right now, there are 3 protocols that are in the process of getting ready to be enacted, hopefully by the early fall, mid-September, in which 2 of which are a comparison of AZT and DDI in individuals who have been on AZT for either a short period of time and another protocol for a longer period of time. There's also a DDI protocol for individuals who have been intolerant to AZT, and namely they could not take the drug because of some serious toxic side effects. Excuse me?
4 protocols?
There are
total?
3 protocols.
3 protocols?
3 protocols. 1 AZT intolerant and 2 protocols for DDI matched against AZT.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman has been trying to be
I'm
recognized.
Jeff Neesmith with Cox Newspapers. Dr. Fauci, is there any data, or will there be any data on how many people go from more than 500 T4 cells to fewer than 500 T4, move from those 2 categories?
Yes, in fact, when I mentioned that the 500, with the greater than 500 arm of that protocol will continue. So we will have data on those individuals and be able to follow them if, in fact, they decrease down below 500.
Follow up. If there is a delay in their moving from the more than 500 to the fewer than 500, then would that mean that more than 600,000 people might benefit, or maybe somebody who got AIDS yesterday?
If the study if that arm of the protocol proves positive, then in fact you'll see the same sort of discussions as we're hearing today for 500 and less. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we're continuing the study, to precisely answer that question as to whether or not it would be appropriate and beneficial in the delay of the onset of symptoms for people even who have quite normal T4 cells. That study is continuing to proceed.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci, come back.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear the question.
Could you run through the numbers again that you gave when you talk about how many people got AIDS?
74 and 38.
Because
Yeah, there were 74 progressions in the whole study. No, in the whole study. No, it was 3,200 people in the whole study, okay? Let's start off with the whole study, 019, 3,200 people. Of that, 1,300 of them fell within the less than 500 CD4 positive cells, 1,300. Of that group of less than 500 CD4 cells, there were 74 progressions either to severe ARC or to AIDS. If you break them down, there were 55 out of that 74 who progressed to AIDS, and there were 19 out of that 74 that progressed to severe ARC. Severe ARC being defined as 2 or more symptoms and less than 200 T4 cells. Of that group of progressors, of the 74, now we're going to focus on the 74 who progressed in that less than 500 group. 38 of those were contained in the placebo group compared to 17 who were in the low dose group compared to 19 who were in the high dose group. All of those numbers add up. All of those numbers add up.
38 placebo when progressed and 36
No, it doesn't. Not at all. There were separate limbs of the protocol. Okay?
The denominator there was 1,300 divided by 3, you had a third of 1,300 were in the placebo, and the high dose, a third in the low dose.
Right.
So did the people in both the low and the high dose of AZT, it took them a year longer to develop any symptoms?
No, what it says that over the 2 years of the study, with a mean of 1 year, there was a delay in progression to either ARC or either severe ARC or AIDS in twice as many people on placebo than on the low dose. Yeah.
Since, I mean, you've got 36 people who are on AZT,
Paul?
whether high or low dose, who went on to get AIDS
Yeah.
or ARC.
There are 2 AZT arms. Paul, why don't you
I'll try it. I think you've done a pretty good job.
I thought so too, but we'll try to clear it up.
Basically, one way to look at this,
Paul
Volberding from San Francisco, one way to look at this is that there really, in a sense, are two separate studies. There's one study where the patients had greater than 500 helper cells at first, another study where they had less than that. There were about 1,300 in the second study. In that study, those 1,300 were divided into three groups. One group got placebo, one group got low-dose AZT, the other group got high-dose AZT. 38 of the first group progressed, 17 of the second, 19 of the third. So overall, the rates of progression, if you were treated with AZT, were about half of the progression rates in the people that were treated with placebo. Three separate arms of the study, that's the key. No, the difference between 17 and 19 isn't significant.
You say in here that there were no significant difference in side effects between the high dose and the low dose, which could imply to a layperson at least.
Between low dose and placebo.
Between low dose and placebo.
Not between
Low dose was less toxic than high dose.
You have to explain to me then why, if I add up the total number of people who got AZT, it's roughly the same number of people who went on to AIDS or ARC who got a placebo. And that just...
Twice as many people got AZT as got placebo, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let me give you some other numbers. There were about 450 people in each of the groups, in the placebo, the low dose, and the high dose. So there are roughly 900 people getting AZT, half of them low dose, half of them high dose. So the progression rates per year of follow-up were half of that in the placebo group if you were getting AZT.
I think it's important to emphasize that the confusion is if you're thinking in terms of the study split in half. It isn't split in half. There are twice as many patients who are getting AZT are getting placebo. So if it was split in half, you'd say, now wait a minute, 38 and then there's 17 plus 19, it's the same thing. It isn't, because there are twice as many patients on that treatment arm, and you're going to compare them to the placebo arm. So there really is, the numbers work quite well.
No, I think you can.
We can. The choice of 500 cells was made in many respects empirically, because if one looks at the numbers of CD4 positive cells in a normal individual, with some variability from lab to lab, it'll range somewhere between 600 and 1,200. So when you're dealing with 500, you're really just below the level of what we call the normal limits, but nonetheless abnormal, but not so severely immunosuppressed that you would expect there to be an event being described as an opportunistic infection or some other progression to disease. And the reason that was chosen so that you could divide it up into individuals who are relatively immunologically intact compared to people who go from that borderline of immunologically intact down to severe immunosuppression. It's something that we as clinicians use as that cutoff point where you're not completely out of danger of progressing, but it would be unlikely that you would progress at that level, so that you can have a starting point enough to see changes one way or the other. That's the reason. It's an empiric decision, but that's what's generally used clinically. No, it's 500 CD4 cells per cubic millimeter of blood. MM3 superscript.
Can I draw you back to the issue of finances again? And
You're talking to the wrong person on that, really.
No, well, perhaps I'm not interested in the specific money, and I think everybody applauds the step that's taken today, but everybody looks obviously at the issue of funding as it comes down the road. Do you see problems here? Is this sufficiently funded?
Again, that is an area of which I have no authority nor expertise, so I'll have to leave that to the appropriate people to answer. I do the clinical research, not the healthcare financing. And I'm not qualified to answer that question.
100,000 number did you get that from about half of all people you estimate to be infected with the AIDS virus?
It's an estimate, and it's an estimate based on an estimate, but that's the best we can do. Let me explain how it's gotten. We have a large multi-center AIDS cohort study of approximately 5,000 gay men who we follow prospectively for several years now. And as we follow them, we get a feel for what the ranges of CD4 cells are among that cohort of 5,000 individuals. We do it for a number of reasons: how fast they progress when they come into the study, what's the cutoff point at which they may be in grave danger of getting an opportunistic infection. If you look at the breakdown of the profile of that 5,000 group of individuals who are HIV infected, the relative percentage of people that fall into that category, and you extrapolate that to a presumed 1 to 1.5 million individuals in the country who are infected with HIV, then you get that estimate of what we're talking about. I might add that that's the same study that allowed us to make that prediction that if an individual has 200 or less T4 cells, they have a significant chance of developing pneumocystis pneumonia, upon which the recommendation for primary prophylaxis with aerosolized pentamidine was made, the same sort of prospective epidemiologic study.
Half of all people infected with AIDS
Approximately. But again, you're talking about the numbers that you've heard us say before are estimates and can have a degree of standard error in that. Yes?
How many of those 600,000 people are Medicare eligible?
Again, we're asking questions in an area that I have absolutely no expertise. I'm sorry.
I estimate that very few of them are over 65 or on disability.
I
for
really
2
don't
years.
want to make any statement about health care delivery. I just, not that I'm begging off, I'm totally unqualified to do that. You probably know more about that than I do.
Well, how are doctors around the country, now that this announcement's been made, are they now able to prescribe AZT to people with asymptomatic HIV infection?
Since AZT is a drug that's already on the market, physicians can at their discretion prescribe it for whatever it is that they want to prescribe it for. The general pattern of reimbursement is usually related to the FDA approval for that indication. And that's what the Secretary was talking about when he's saying the FDA will move as quickly as possible to address this issue and expand the indication for AZT. That will take some time. They will obviously have to have the opportunity to review the data before they make that decision. And as Dr. Barry just mentioned, we all knew about this yesterday late afternoon, so I think we need some more time to look at that.
Dr. Fauci, I assume we cannot extrapolate from these findings as to the efficacy of AZT for people who are uninfected, who may be engaging in risky behavior
No.
but remain uninfected.
Yeah.
But are there any trials in the works on that?
No. The answer is I think that would really be rather a majestic leap to go from what we're talking about to prophylaxis.
As well.
Yes.
But what about trials to look into this in the future?
Of using AZT in uninfected individuals? Well, I think in the general population, if you're talking about uninfected individuals who might be practicing high-risk behavior, there are no trials on that. There are trials looking, for example, at individuals, healthcare workers who may be infected possibly infected by a finger stick, as well as studies in unborn fetuses in which the mother is given AZT to determine whether or not you can prevent the onset in that 30 to 40% of newborn infants who become infected from an infected mother. But if you're talking about general population, someone who goes out and exposes themselves, for example, in a sexual encounter, at the present time there are no studies addressing that. Yes?
With the Journal of NIH Research, could you give us a little bit of background on the natural history of these CD4 counts? How long typically in these 5,000 people that you've been watching does it take from the time they, for example, first go into testing to progress to 500, and then from the time they reach 500 to progress to the 200 point or to serious symptoms of AIDS?
Sure. I can't give you the exact numbers on that, but you've probably read about this already in some of the journals, that when individuals get HIV infected, they usually get an initial drop in CD4 cells and then plateau for variable periods of time, followed by an insidious drop in cells, sometimes with precipitous drops along the way. That is usually measured in years. In fact, if one looks at the mean period of time, both in the United States studies and in European studies, from the time an individual was felt to have been infected to the time that they develop AIDS, which is, you can guess, is about the time when they fall to a rather critical low level of CD4 cells, it's measured in anywhere from 8 to 10 years. So you're talking about a considerable period of time.
This news briefing will re-air tomorrow morning at 7:10 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 10 minutes after 4 o'clock in the morning for our viewers on the West Coast. Stay with us now for a speech by General Colin Powell, coming up next.